Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. Dedicated to fostering a rational and evidence-based approach to Canadian security and defense, the CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, content, and publications. In today's episode, Dr. Lubomyr Luciuk, a leading authority in political geography and Ukrainian history, and professor at the Royal Military College of Canada, discusses the buildup to the Ukraine war in depth. We'll touch on geopolitical dynamics between Ukraine and Russia, the impact of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the role of international agreements like the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine's relationship with NATO, and the long-term consequences of the conflict for both Ukraine and the West. This is the Expert Series. Dr. Luciuk, it's a pleasure to have you on the program today, and I'm looking forward to what I think is going to be a really lively discussion. Can we begin by dissecting how the dissolution of the Soviet Union impacted the geopolitical dynamics between Ukraine and Russia? And could you also touch on what role international agreements like the Budapest Memorandum have played in shaping the relationship?
Look, the desire on the part of the Ukrainian nation to be independent and to return to its rightful place in Europe is long-standing. I think all historians, political scientists, political geographers like myself would underscore that fact. That said, there was also a long historical association between those two nations. As long as we appreciate that Ukrainians are not Russians, never were Russians, and certainly after this unprovoked war against Ukraine will never be Russians again, the reality of it is we also have to recognize that there were relations between these two neighboring states for many years within the context of the Soviet Union, the Russian state dominating the USSR. But when it all then finally, thankfully, collapsed in 1991, there was a new geopolitical, if you like, agenda. And that was, where do we go from here? You suddenly had 15 states that re-emerged, I'll say, from the Soviet Union. Some of them quite old states with distinct cultures and languages. Think of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, think of Ukraine, others that had been cobbled together in the Soviet period, but also over decades had come to develop their own national identities. Some ancient states, Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine. In the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think, and I was actually in the Soviet Union in 89 and 90 and 91 several times, there was a sense that, okay, we're glad that's gone. Now, how do we find our way forward? And of course, it was a confusing time. It was a time of economic dislocation, of political uncertainty. One of the things that was insisted upon by the West as this was all happening was that Ukraine essentially demilitarize. And of course, the pressure was on to give up its share of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, which it began to do. I think I was and I can be corrected on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, that I was the only Western academic who in November of 1991, so just before the Soviet Union collapsed, actually had an article published in the Globe and Mail in which I argued that Ukraine might want to be a neutral state, but should hang on to at least some of its nuclear weapons for its own security. And I remember being poo-pooed by all sorts of people. How dare you say that, and so on. Well, told you so. I've now met many a Ukrainian, not just since 2014, but particularly in the more recent period, when they have looked back on that prescient, rather op-ed by me and said, we wish we had listened. Yes, they signed the Budapest Memorandum because in the Ukrainian worldview, this represented a guarantee on the part of the United States, the United Kingdom, and yes, even the Russian Federation, that Ukraine's political independence and territorial integrity and sovereignty would be protected and respected if it gave up its nuclear weapons. Well, they've learned that the Budapest Memorandum was not worth the paper it was written on. They've learned at great cost, particularly in the last few years. I think, if I look back on that period and I say to myself, well, what should they have held on to? Well, not the ICBMs. I mean, Ukraine wasn't interested in threatening, Washington or London or Berlin or anything like, or even Moscow for that matter. It was interested in protecting itself, its borders, its territory, tactical nuclear weapons, which they had at the time, and which some military people who I met at the time told me they were going to hold on to a few, no matter what they said. But I don't think they did. They certainly had the technical ability to utilize those weapons. They had the knowledge. I mean, don't forget that a lot of the Soviet Union's missiles were actually made in Kharkiv. They were made in Soviet Ukraine. Some of those missiles are being used against Ukraine now, which is ironic and sad. So they had the ability to stay, at least in part, a nuclear state. And I certainly wish they had. I'm sorry, but the reality of it is, when I look at the world in which we live today, in the 21st century, that was the 20th, the 21st century now, I see a world in which countries like North Korea, Israel, Pakistan, India, potentially Iran, tie their security and their ability to resist international pressure to their ability to field nuclear weapons. No one wants to put their finger into that. They might, sure, we could obliterate North Korea in half an hour or an hour or whatever it is. But the reality of it is, some of us might get obliterated too. So we don't put our fingers in this pie. Israel has nuclear weapons, but doesn't talk a lot about it because, everybody kind of knows you don't push it too far. Pakistan and India, I mean, two states which have had belligerent relations at points in history, in recent history, are both nuclear powers. Why is it good for all those countries to have nuclear weapons, but Ukraine, no? Why was it good for the Russian Federation to retain a nuclear capacity, but for Ukraine, no? That I still don't understand. And I think when I reflect on it, it seems to me that this was because of a prejudice against Ukraine in the Western mindset. And I was born and raised in Kingston, Ontario. I'm a Canadian of Ukrainian heritage, obviously, you can see by name. But when I was growing up, there was a great deal of ignorance and indifference to the very existence of anything called Ukraine or Ukrainians. I mean, in Canada, yeah, all those Ukrainians in the prairies, pioneer settlers and all that stuff, churches, pierogies, dance festivals and stuff. People appreciated the cultural part of it. But in terms of the politics of there being a Ukrainian state or a Ukraine's independence, there was widespread ignorance, indifference, and sometimes antipathy to it. If you look at Department of External Affairs records, at least into the 60s and 70s, Canada was not in support of Ukrainian independence. If you look at British Foreign Office documents, same thing. American Foreign Office documents, same thing. The West was generally indisposed towards Ukrainian independence. You might remember even President Bush's so-called chicken cave speech, stick with the Soviet Union. For Ukrainians, this was not widely understood. I think a lot of Ukrainians, when I meet my counterparts there, and I travel fairly often, didn't understand. They looked at the West and said, the West is the free world. It's a beacon of hope. They support us in our desire to be an independent state, to return to our rightful place in Europe. Naive. I, as a young man, believed that the West felt that way. Naive. The more research you do, the more you look at it, the more you realize that, states have interests, and those interests don't necessarily always coincide with Ukraine's independence. That said, 1991 comes, and there is an independent Ukraine. It had been at the United Nations as a kind of a, founding state, but obviously under the Soviet thumb. Now there's a Ukraine, and it's independent, and it has borders. And the people in Ukraine, first of all, the trauma of coming out of the Soviet experience with all the horrors that implied, but then finding their way. It took them some time. I tell my students at the Royal Military College sometimes when they ask me, how long will it take for Ukraine to become normal? This was before the war broke out. And I used to always say, well, think of the good book. Think of the story of Moses leading his people, the Israelites, out of Egyptian bondage. It may be a fable, but the interesting story is that Moses takes his people out of bondage, and they wander around in the desert for 40 years. Now, anybody who can look at a map knows it wouldn't take 40 years to walk from Egypt to Israel/Palestine, whatever you want, the Holy Land, right? So, I joke and I say, well, that's because he didn't ask for directions. He's a man. But The story is, if you read the Bible, that he wandered his people through the desert while all the people who had been born in captivity died off, because you can't create an independent state with a slave mentality. Even Moses himself looked down on the promised land and could see that the next generation was going to get there, but even he didn't get into it. And so, I say it'll take 40 years. So add 1991, 40 years, 2034. It's a long process to nurture national identity and consciousness and solidarity, to create the sort of new generation that will take the reins of power. And that's happening now for two reasons. One is a lot of the young men and women who are in the Ukrainian armed forces are post-Soviet. But just having lunch with a colonel from there, he was born in 86, so he's not quite there. And he said to me, he said, the younger people behind me are different than I am. Even though he was only in the Soviet Union for 4 or 5 years, still there's a mentality. Some of the older officers in the Ukrainian armed forces may be very competent as soldiers. They still have that mindset. It's that young generation that is remarkable. It doesn't matter what language they speak. I saw them on the front lines in 2017. They were all speaking to each other in, essentially Russian or a kind of Surzhyk, a kind of a patois, Ukrainian Russian. But they sure could tell the difference between their Russian and that Russian over on the other side. Absolutely. I couldn't, but they could. So they know Europe. They know the world. They're in their 30s, late 20s, 30s. They've traveled, they've studied, they've read, they've interacted on the internet with other people. They have seen the world, and they have recognized Ukraine's role in the world and its place in the world. And again, even as a scholar, when I was a boy, there were virtually no books in English on Ukraine. Now, I can't read fast enough. And you can see behind me, I have a large library. I read every day. I buy books every week. I can't keep up with all the stuff on Ukraine. I went to Ambassador Galadze's lecture at RMC on the weekend to about 200 students and staff at the college. And I was sitting in the back of the room listening to the Q&A after she spoke and thinking, there's an awful lot of young men and women in the Canadian forces that know a lot about Ukraine. That was definitely not the case 20 years ago or 30 years ago or when I was an undergraduate. No way. They couldn't find it on a map. So enormous change in the way in which Canadians and the world appreciate and understand Ukraine. And that has been enhanced, strengthened by the valor of Ukrainians defending their homeland against the unprovoked aggression of the KGB man in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin. The genocidal agenda, and I'll call it what it is, the genocidal agenda of Russia against Ukrainians has solidified Ukrainian national identity and unity as never before. Putin the other night was saying, well, Lenin and Stalin gave us, Greek Ukraine. I mean, total nonsense. But no, actually, if you want to take credit, you take credit. Because whereas before, in the late 90s and early 2000s, you might say, well, there is a kind of a regional cleavage. There's Western Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, Central Ukraine. They have different perspectives and so on. Yeah, that was true. In the East, there was a more, an orientation on the next door neighbors right over there, and they speak Russian, so we'll speak Russian. We do a lot of business with them. We're an industrial part of Ukraine, and they are too, and so we have things in common. Oh, those Western Ukrainians, yeah, well, okay, yeah, but they're us, but they're different. Now, wow, that's totally gone. The solidarity that's emerged, the sense of purpose, the sense of self-sacrifice. It's just I thank God every day practically, not for the war, not for the horrors that have been imposed on Ukraine by the Kremlin, but to have lived to see not only Ukrainian independence, which my parents, who were refugees from Ukraine after the Second World War, I got to see independence. I've actually got to see the War of Independence, and I've got to see a new generation that is literally forging in fire a new national identity. The Ukraine that will, or Ukraine, I should say, Ukraine that will emerge out of this war, and I think it will emerge victorious, will be something remarkable. I remember once hearing President Zelensky, who, by the way, I refer to you as Ukraine's Moses, because he's leading his people out of bondage. Brilliant man, brilliant man. He may only last the war in the sense of, he might not be the right guy for the post-war period. But what's happened now is just the most remarkable transformation of the largest country in Europe, now recognized by all its neighbors, and even neighbors with whom historically there have been tensions. Think of Poland and Ukraine; they had some problems. Think of Ukraine and Germany. I mean, what the Germans did in Ukraine in the Second World War was mind-boggling. All that's gone. People now treat Ukraine. You cannot pick up the Globe and Mail or the Star or the Post or the Hill Times, whatever you want to pick up, and not read about Ukraine every day. Do you know how rare it was when I was your age or a boy? If you saw the word Ukraine, you were amazed. I would go to the local public library and I couldn't find a book about Ukraine in English. Now, like I said, it's saturated, and that's because I think the world is decolonizing still. We're still in that process of this disintegration of the final empires, of which the Soviet Union and the so-called Russian Federation is one. People's Republic of China is probably another. There may be others. These things are still decaying, deteriorating, collapsing. That is being resisted by revanchists and chauvinists and imperialists who don't want to give up the ghost, but it's inexorable. And so when I haven't been able to go to Ukraine since 2017, unfortunately, but talk to people there on an almost daily basis. And the Ukraine that will emerge out of this, as I say, is going to be something to be seen. Well, Zelensky once referred to it as a second Israel. And I think that, or becoming like a second Israel. And I think that's what you're going to see. I think you're going to see a battle-hardened, realist state that is going to understand that its security will not be guaranteed by anything short of its own ability to protect itself. And that is the Israeli model. Whether Ukraine gets into NATO, and I certainly think it's earned its right to be in NATO, far more than some other states, that's for sure. But it's earned its right, and it should be in NATO and in the European Union. Those will be helpful steps forward, essential steps forward to secure the peace of Europe, not just of Ukraine. But I don't think you'll ever, ever, ever again see Ukraine after this war that will say, oh, okay, we're in the NATO alliance now, we're okay. I mean, you heard what former President Trump said just the other day. Don't pay your dues, maybe we won't come to your rescue. I mean, and unfortunately, we've seen echoes of this kind of naive stupidity, pure blind ignorance in Canada as well, and in some of the political organizations. We stand together or we fall individually. And Ukraine right now has proven to the world, not only that Ukrainians aren't Russians, never were and never will be, but that they want to be part of Europe, and they want to see their role as being a positive one in Europe. And it will be. I mean, you're adding a country the size, slightly bigger, slightly smaller than France, of 40 million people plus, give or take, who are well educated, many of whom speak English, who have demonstrated their desire to live in a liberal democratic world, small L, small d. What's not to want? Are you kidding me? Europe should be bending over backwards. NATO should be bending over backwards. You are going to have the best army in Europe in terms of battlefield experience in your ranks, and one that is going to be certainly very acutely sensitive to the neighborhood. Now, there are other neighbors. Think of Poland. Poland is arming itself like never before. I mean, Poland's defense procurement in the last several months is, or at least what they're putting on their shopping list, is just like, wow. Ukraine will be like that too. And with the new understanding that's come out of this, with the ties that have been forged between Estonia and Latvia and Ukraine, I mean, they were sort of there, on historical discussions and things, but now it's more military. With Poland, the accession of Finland into NATO, of Sweden to come, turning the Baltic into a NATO lake, as they say. That's something similar is going to happen in the Black Sea. Old historic ties and linkages are going to leave Russia beyond the pale. And again, some people, I'll be very honest with you, if you had asked me these kinds of questions a decade ago, I would have said that there's an essential cultural unity, that the Russia of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky belongs in Europe, right? Because these are, Russian scientists are the same as French scientists, Russian poets explore the same themes as Italian poets. And so, it was all one culture, the one educational system, similar religious worldviews and foundations. But after this, no, Russia's out. Russia is not waging war because only Putin and a small group of his confederates in the Kremlin had decided to do that. They may have initiated it, but he enjoys widespread support within the general Russian population. And so they are collectively guilty of the atrocities, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, this genocidal agenda. And so Russia does not belong in the community of civilized states and nations in the world. You still have to engage with them. You can't just say, well, we're not going to talk to you. That doesn't work. But, there's certain, you're not welcome in the club. Yeah, we recognize you're out there in the street. We'll say something to you from time to time, but you're not inside, okay? Ukraine, on the other hand, has earned its place. And, it should, as I say, stand beside Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, all the former Warsaw Pact countries that have managed, to their good luck, to join the EU and NATO. Again, think about who we, the West, let in. We let in Hungary and Poland and Estonia and Latvia and Bulgaria and Ukraine. Oh, yeah, well, here's the pathway to the EU. Here's the pathway to NATO. Here's Partnership for Peace. We've been telling them they're going to get into NATO since 2008. It's 2024 now.
Could you please explain some of the factors influencing Ukraine's current relationship with NATO? Additionally, why do some circles express skepticism about Ukraine's strong interest in NATO? Is this skepticism primarily due to political dynamics within NATO involving different countries and their interests? I'm interested in hearing your perspective on this matter.
Well, I think the reason Ukraine is not in NATO is because of this long-standing, lingering prejudice. Many of the countries, particularly in West Central Europe, didn't know much about Ukraine. Of course they know about it. They could see atlases, read a book and so on, but they didn't have much experience of it. The people who have been pressing the hardest for Ukraine to join NATO or in the European Union are these European countries that will experience Soviet/Russian rule or occupation. So Poland has been a great friend. The Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states have been great friends. They've all said yes, 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 in. The ones that have been sort of reluctant are the ones like French, the Italians, even to some degree Great Britain, because they have still a mindset of great Russia. They haven't decolonized mentally. And so although, the old joke about NATO was it was meant to keep, the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out, the reality of it is, when you say Russians out in NATO, that included Ukraine, right? It was like, I don't know what they are. They're like South Little Russians, some of them fought against the Soviets, but they're just all the same. There was a prejudice. It's hard to, like, I remember reading some Foreign Office documents, British Foreign Office documents, where people are trying to define what a Ukrainian is. And at one point, I happen to love this definition, magnificent crossbred scallywags. What's not to love? With a decidedly Oriental kink in their brains. I'm not quite sure what it means, but I love it. I mean, only a Brit can write it that way. Humbug, but wonderful. There was, East Galicia is outside our beat and always will be, this kind of stuff. Covering up the whole of the war. The British knew all about it, covered it up because they didn't want to offend the great Russians or the Soviets. So I think there's, this debate about whether to let them in, although I think it's been, because of the last couple of years, it's eroded this opposition. Because again, NATO is, understands its interests. You're going to get a well-educated, battle-hardened nation to join you. That's pretty useful, right? I remember when I was in Yavoriv, in the training base, the polygon, as they called it, for Ukrainian soldiers rotating away from the front lines with British, Canadian, and American troops there. And those Ukrainians were teaching the Americans and the Brits and the Canadians as much as they were learning. Like, it wasn't a one-way thing. Now, very helpful for preparing the Ukrainians for what they're facing now, and that training is still going on. But when it was being done in Western Ukraine, in Yavoriv, just outside of Lviv, I noticed that those Ukrainians were teaching our troops a lot because they're actually in a war, right? It's one thing to be a Canadian and say, well, we deployed here, there, and there, small numbers over short periods of time. It's another thing to be in a full-scale war for several years. And Ukraine began fighting in 2014. So, it's a 10-year-long war now, which has gone up and down in intensity. So I think the opposition to Ukraine and NATO and the EU, well, obviously the EU has already sort of moved it closer to NATO, is eroding. I think Ukraine will end up in both fairly soon. I certainly see Ukraine insisting upon that, despite the fact that they've recently negotiated some bilateral security arrangements with Great Britain and so on. The sense in Ukraine, in the general public, is that that's a bare minimum. If they had been members of NATO, these last 2 years would probably not have happened. You can look it up. I wrote a piece for the Globe and Mail just before Putin invaded. January or something like that in 2022, in which I said, if Putin stops now, he's won. Because he's putting pressure, the military was all gathering around the borders and they were sort of threatening war. No, we're just having exercises. But then people say, well, no, this is getting threatening and so on. Putin might have been able to pressure Ukraine into concessions if he hadn't invaded. But the moment they crossed the border and the moment Ukrainians realized that this is real and these guys are coming to occupy us and to hurt us, and then when those first horrific scenes came out of Bucha and Irpin and all these places, that's it. You think anyone's going to give up to that now? I mean, that's why Ukrainians are fighting. It's you've heard this, I'm sure, before. It's existential for them. They can't give up. If Ukraine gives up, Ukraine ceases to exist. No, you might end up with piles and piles, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians coming to Canada, build us up. But the reality of it is, even the ones who've left Ukraine, who I've met here in Kingston and in other places across Canada, I'd say the majority of them still want to return to a liberated Ukraine.
As we conclude this interview, I'd like to shift our focus to the West. Could you please share your perspective on how the West has supported Ukraine and how effective you believe the support has been? Additionally, considering the significance of the conflict for Ukraine, what broader implications does the war hold for the West?
Too little, hopefully not too late. Dithering with the distribution and provision of military supplies. You'll recall that at first Germany gave 5,000 helmets. Thank you very much. Here's 3 tanks. Here's 4 Javelin missiles. It was all this dribble and promises and pledges and humanitarian aid or non-lethal aid. And, this discussion went forward so slowly. And meanwhile, people were literally dying on the front. So I think one of the things that historians will see when they look back on this was that the pre-existing prejudices and ignorance and indifference that existed in the West militated against a speedy supply of what was needed by the Ukrainians to defend themselves. And that cost Ukrainians many lives, deaths and injuries. That's slowly changing, but even now you see the debate in the United States, how much do we give them? Do we give it to them? Even though we all know that most of that money is actually spent in the United States on their military industrial complex, and then they give us their surplus stuff to Ukraine and they build new stuff. There are still people who say we don't want to give money to Ukraine. Well, you're not giving it to Ukraine. Most of it stays in the United States. Same thing in Canada. So I think the sad part of this is that there was a kind of an indifference and an ignorance that was prejudicial to Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Plus, then there was a kind of naive expectation that war is like what you see on television, that this will be a blitzkrieg. Well, you gave the Russians months to dig in. And like any intelligent being who wants to survive, you're going to dig a deep hole if you've got 9 months and these guys are going to come for them and you're going to put landmines out there. All these people say, oh, we're against landmines. Well, tell the Russians that, right? I mean, they're the ones that have made Ukraine the most mined country in the world. And they've been able to resist Ukrainian counteroffensives because of that. And yet, despite that, Ukraine has moved forward. It is winning on the ground and on the sea, and maybe eventually in the air. But again, even then, here's 6 F-16s. Here's a promise for 20 next month. Train your pilot. I mean, all of this is so slow at a time when Ukraine needs weapons yesterday, not tomorrow. So, my assessment is that the West did not honor the obligations that Ukrainians expected it would honor in reference to things like the Budapest Memorandum. The West did not act in a united or thoughtful and coordinated, powerful way to help Ukraine deter Russian aggression. It's still lagging behind. And this will have consequences for the post-war architecture of Europe. Ukraine must win this war, and I still believe it will win this war. When it wins this war, what kind of Ukraine will we have? And I think we will have a Ukraine in which a large number of people will be skeptical of the West. They'll still want to get into NATO, and hopefully soon will in the European Union. That's more certain. But they will no longer be as naive as they were. And so in a sense, this is Ukraine's war of independence, but it's a war of independence not only from the shackles of what was the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation and all of that historical legacy of empire, but also from the naivete that many Ukrainians had about the West. So this will be a very different Ukraine. I hope to be around long enough to see it.
Dr. Luciuk, you've been a great guest. Thank you for your insightful perspectives on the dynamics surrounding Ukraine's relationship with NATO and Russia, as well as the broader implications for global geopolitics. I think this discussion today has shed light on the complexities shaping this pivotal moment in international affairs for our listeners. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.